Welcome back, everybody. My name is Tucker, and with the NBA season just a few short days away, there of course are going to be a lot of predictions being thrown around on YouTube and in articles and things like that, and I'll certainly include myself in that. But to me, the most interesting thing to try and predict about this upcoming NBA season is by far the MVP race. Now, as has been discussed on this channel and pretty much everywhere since free agency ended, all of the player movement of this offseason has created an environment in which things are completely wide open in the NBA as it relates to the championship chase, and I think that also extends to the MVP race. There are just as many possible MVP candidates this season as there are potential title contenders, which makes it really difficult to try and predict who will actually end up winning the award, but that's exactly what I'm going to try and do in this video. And how am I going to do that? By taking a deep dive into the history of the NBA MVP award, taking and analyzing data from the past 5 years and even as far back as the last 20 years of NBA history, and use that to try and come up with some similarities in the MVP voting over that time to figure out who the most likely winners for this season will be, and ultimately land on a one-player conclusion. So the first thing that we're going to do is look back at some past MVP winners and try and create some categories and further understand what about that particular season caused them to win the MVP, whether it be some sort of narrative around their season or the statistical context of that season. Whatever it may be, we want to try and come up with what made those seasons special to potentially predict what players could also fit that same category and potentially win the MVP this year. Now, when we do that, I'm only going to be going back to the 2014-15 season because that is when the league really started to change into what it is today, and the game is just played so much differently now than it was even 10 years ago. So really only the last 5 years of data is what we have to go off of to help predict an MVP in the modern game for these specific categories that I'm creating. So first, let's go and look at the 2014-15 NBA MVP, Steph Curry. That team, the Golden State Warriors, finished with a 67-15 record, which was the best in the league. You can see Steph's stats on screen, and prior to the season, he was plus 1,600 to win the award, which was tied for 6th in the preseason MVP odds that year. He also got 100 of the 130 first place votes, almost 77% of the votes that given year, with only James Harden and LeBron James receiving first place votes. And the best way to describe why Steph Curry won the MVP this year, obviously he had an outstanding season, but most specifically we can categorize this as he was the best player on the best team that year. His team had the best record, he was the best player on that team, and that is a common theme amongst many MVPs, but specifically the last 5 years, being the best player on the best regular season team, considering that this is a regular season award, is really important, and we can definitely put Steph Curry's season that year into that category. And now we move on to the 2015-16 MVP, which was also Steph Curry. The Warriors finished with a 73-9 record that year, which was best in the league and best in league history. And the important thing to note about his statistics here is his points per game increased from the prior season by over 6 points per game. Prior to the season, Steph was plus 650 to win the MVP, which was tied for 3rd, and he was actually a unanimous MVP in the voting, receiving 131 of the first place votes. And the interesting thing about Steph Curry's second MVP is that he qualifies for multiple categories, not only being the best player on the best team like we talked about previously, but he also had a career statistical year as well as historically had an absolutely insane statistical season that year. He made over 400 threes. He's the only player ever to do that, and shot over 45% from 3 that season as well, which establishes to this point 3 categories: best player on the best team, a career statistical year, or a historic statistical year, which Steph qualified for all 3 in that season. Moving on now, let's talk about the 2016-17 NBA MVP, Russell Westbrook. The Thunder finished with a 47-35 record that year, which was 6th in the Western Conference. Westbrook's stats can be seen on screen, and again, it's important to note the over 8 point per game increase in his point per game average that year compared to the previous season. Before the year, Russ was ranked at 1st in the preseason NBA MVP odds at plus 200, and he received 69 of the 101 first place votes that year, a little bit over 68%, with James Harden, Kawhi Leonard, and LeBron James being the only other players to receive first place MVP votes. And although, as you'll see a little bit later, this specific MVP campaign was a little bit of an outlier, it's pretty easy to see why he won it when you put him in the category of not only a career statistical year for him personally, as you can see by the points per game numbers, as well as his per game averages in general increasing that season, but also a historic statistical season, becoming the first player since Oscar Robertson to average a triple-double in a single season. So it's pretty easy to see what categories Russell Westbrook is placed in, as well as why he won the MVP that year, even though it was a slightly controversial one. Moving on now to the 2017-18 NBA MVP, James Harden. The Rockets finished with a 65-17 record that year, which was first in the league. James Harden averaged over 30 a game, almost 9 assists per game, and got to the free throw line a ton. And prior to that season, he was plus 1100 to win the NBA MVP, 7th best odds before that season. He got 86 of the 101 first place votes, a little bit over 85%, and LeBron was the only other player to get first place votes that year with just 15. And interestingly, because James Harden is such a statistical machine, he doesn't actually qualify for a career year here, because the year before he actually averaged over double-digit assists. So he didn't really show a huge increase in his per game stats, nor did he have a necessarily historic statistical year, but he did qualify for the best player on the best team category, which is ultimately why he ended up winning the MVP that year. And now we move on to the most recent NBA MVP, Giannis Antetokounmpo. The Bucks finished with a 60-22 record, which was the best record in the Eastern Conference and in the league. Giannis put up outstanding statistics and was plus 475 prior to the season to win the MVP, which was third best in the league. He received 78 of the 101 first place votes, a little bit over 77%, and James Harden was the only other player to receive a first place vote with 23 of them. And Giannis qualifies in kind of 1.5 categories here. He obviously gets the best player on the best team category, but also a bit of a statistical season from some per game stats, but more had a breakout season, which I'm not really qualifying as a category here, but certainly he was the best player on the best team regular season last year, and that's why he won his MVP. And the reason that I'm talking about these individual MVP campaigns at such length is because they are so statistically viable, and these players got a ton of the first place votes. Russell Westbrook was the lowest at 68%, but every other MVP in the last 5 years got at least 76% of the first place votes, which certainly makes them statistically viable to go back and look and try and predict who could win the MVP this year. Which to me means that you can pretty safely put these down as criteria to win a modern day NBA MVP. Be the best player on the best regular season team, which was every single MVP of the last 5 years, with the exception of Russell Westbrook in 2016-17. Have a career statistical year from a personal standpoint, which 2015-16 Steph and 2016-17 Russ both qualified for, or put up historic overall statistics, which once again Steph's second MVP and Russ in 16-17 qualify for, with the most reliable of those being to be the best player on the best team. Now, with that established, there is another really interesting trend over the last 20 years of NBA basketball in terms of MVP winners, and that is the prevalence of first-time MVP winners. Since 2000, there have been exactly 6 MVP winning seasons that were not first-time winners. Tim Duncan in 2003, Steve Nash in 2006, LeBron in 2010, 12, and 13, and Steph Curry in 2016. So just 6 times in the last 19 NBA seasons has the MVP been a player that had already won the award in the past, and 3 of those were LeBron. And with the exception of LeBron, all of those other multiple-time MVP winners won them in back-to-back seasons. They won an MVP and then they won their second in the season immediately after, which means that unless you're LeBron James, players don't win non-consecutive multiple MVP awards in the last 20 years of NBA history. So given that knowledge, let's combine the statistics and the data and the criteria that we've built from the second section and with the first section and come up with a list of players that could potentially win the MVP this upcoming season. Now, as I just discussed in terms of creating this list, players in the last 20 years in the NBA do not win multiple MVPs unless they're winning them back-to-back or their name is LeBron James. So if you're 100% going with that criteria, then this season's MVP would have to be either LeBron, Giannis, because he just won it and could potentially be a back-to-back winner, or a first-time MVP, someone that has not won the award to this point. And with that in mind, for now, I will put LeBron James on the list for potential MVPs this upcoming season. But also keep in mind that he hasn't won an MVP in 7 years and has received an average of just 4.5 first place votes per season in the last 6 seasons since he last won an MVP in 2013. Now, further creating the list, we have to go back and look at the preseason NBA MVP odds for the last 5 MVPs in the NBA. Now, going into those seasons, the eventual MVP of that year has never started lower than 7th in the preseason NBA MVP odds, which technically gives us 8 players to add to the list this year because 2 players are tied for 7th at the moment. That gives us, in order, Giannis, Steph, LeBron, AD, James Harden, Kawhi, Joel Embiid, and Nikola Jokic. So with that list, let's go ahead and go through them and see which ones we can put in these separate categories based off the criteria that we established in the first section, either being potentially the best player on the best team in the league, putting up a career statistical season, or putting up a absolutely historic statistical year. For best player on the best team, I have 4 candidates, 1 being Giannis, 2 Kawhi, 3 Embiid, and 4 Jokic. I could see any of the Bucks, Clippers, Sixers, or Nuggets with the best regular season record in the entire league, and these guys would be the best players on those teams. Now, in terms of career stat guys, I have Giannis, Steph, AD, Embiid, and Jokic. Giannis still has room to grow on offense and will have even more responsibility offensively without Malcolm Brogdon there. Steph will obviously be picking up the slack for the injured Klay Thompson. AD should be a statistical monster with how much the Lakers will have to rely on him. Embiid is the most dominant big in the league when healthy and a scoring machine, and Jokic could put up all-around numbers that would rival the best we've ever seen from a big man in the modern game. In terms of players that could potentially put up a historic statistical season, I have Giannis, Steph, and AD. Giannis could easily average 30 plus and continue to put up insane rebounding numbers in addition to increasing his assists per game. Steph could go back to making 400 threes in a season and averaging 30 plus like he was pre-KD when he won his second MVP, and AD could put up the best statistical season that we've seen from a big in the modern game. So now we have our list of players that are currently in the top 7 in preseason MVP odds, are mostly possible first-time winners, or Giannis is a potential back-to-back winner, or LeBron is the only guy to win multiple MVPs in non-consecutive seasons in the past 20 years, and could make a case to fit any of the 3 criteria established by the last 5 MVP winners of the best player on the best team, having a statistical season that was a career best, or having a historic statistical year. So now let's get to crossing off some players and why I'm taking them off the list. The quickest cross-offs for me are LeBron because he's obviously getting older and he will likely be resting a lot during the season, and I don't think this team can sustain an MVP campaign from both him and Anthony Davis. And the other quicker cross-off is going to be Kawhi Leonard, simply because he's probably going to rest a lot during the season as well. I'd be shocked if he plays more than 60 to 65 games, and you're not going to win the MVP missing that many games. The next group that I'm unfortunately going to have to cross off is the big guys. A non-perimeter player hasn't won an MVP since Dirk in 2007, and the only bigs to win the award since 2000 are Tim Duncan in 02 and 03, Garnett in 04, and Dirk in 2007. They're all great players, and I think they'll have awesome seasons if healthy, but the margin for error is just much slimmer for bigs in the modern NBA, and they'd have to put up crazy stats and be the best player on the best team to win, in my opinion. Which just leaves James Harden, Steph Curry, and Giannis Antetokounmpo on the list. And next up, I'm going to be crossing off James Harden for a couple of reasons. One, he doesn't qualify for any of the 3 criteria that we established earlier. I highly doubt the Rockets are going to be the best team, so he doesn't really qualify there. I don't really see how he can improve statistically from the career year that he had last year, and same thing for a historic statistical campaign. If it wasn't last year and that didn't win it for him, I don't really know how he could improve on that. The only way that I see this happening is if the Rockets are a lot better than people think and potentially push for the best record and he's the best player and wins the MVP, or Russ misses like 50 games and Harden somehow pushes towards averaging over 40 points a game or something like that, or near 40 points a game, and then he would obviously approach the historic statistical season category, but I don't see any of those things as all that likely, so I'm crossing Harden off the list. Which now just leaves Giannis Antetokounmpo and Steph Curry, and as of right now, they are 1 and 2 respectively in preseason odds. Steph qualifies for the crazy statistical year from a personal and historic standpoint, and people are ready for a ridiculous year from him in the post-KD era, and there seems to be a lot of hype and buzz around this season for him. However, unfortunately, Steph does have a few things going against him. He doesn't have much of a chance at being the best player on the best team because from a record standpoint, I doubt the Warriors are going to be able to keep pace and finish with the best record in the league. And again, as I continue to mention, if you're not LeBron James, if you didn't just win the MVP the year before, you're not winning another MVP if you've already won one in a non-consecutive season. Which leaves me with my MVP pick for this upcoming season, Giannis Antetokounmpo. And it might seem boring that I went through all this stuff just to pick the Vegas favorite and the guy that won it last year, but based off this data and the research, it makes sense. He has a chance to qualify for all three of the main criteria that have been established by the last 5 NBA MVP winners as potentially the best player on the best team in the entire league from a record standpoint and having a really good career statistical season or potentially a historic one. And even though he's already won an MVP, he's not disqualified from this discussion based off the last 20 years of NBA MVP history because he did just win it and back-to-back winners are relatively common. And he will likely have even more offensive responsibility this year with Malcolm Brogdon gone and Eric Bledsoe already hurt. And I also think it's realistic to expect him to potentially improve on the offensive end as well from last season, which could further increase his statistics. Now, my worry here is just that they aren't either as good as they were last year, and that could bring down his chances at the best player on the best team thing, plus having played in the World Cup and the heavy workload he'll have to take on for this team, especially early if Bledsoe misses significant time, that could cause him to break down later in the year. But still, I feel the most confident in him, and he would be my MVP pick going into this season. But that is going to be the end of today's video. Once again, my name is Tucker. Hope you guys enjoyed this. If you did, be sure to leave a like, rating down below. That's a great way to let me know that you enjoyed the video, and I will see you all next time.